Louisville, 1960. A skinny 18-year-old boy is sitting on the steps of a house on Grand Avenue with a gold medal around his neck. Not metaphorically, literally. He won it 3 weeks ago in Rome, at the Olympic Games, in front of the entire watching world, and he has not taken it off since. He sleeps in it. He showers in it. His mother has stopped asking him to put it away because she understands, in the way that mothers understand things before they can be spoken, that the medal is doing something for her son that she cannot do herself. It is telling him, every time the light catches it, that he is real, that what happened in Rome was real, that the world saw him and judged him the best, and said so in gold. He wears it into a diner on 4th Street and asks for a hamburger and a Coke. The man behind the counter looks at the medal, looks at the boy, looks at the medal again, and tells him, "They don't serve Negroes here." What happens next has been told many times. The boy leaves. Some versions say he throws the medal into the Ohio River in fury. He himself told this version for years and later walked it back, said he wasn't sure, said maybe it was a bridge, maybe it was rage, maybe the whole story was the kind of truth that feels more accurate than the facts. What is certain is that something broke that day, or rather, something that had already been cracked for a long time finally split clean through, a fault line running not just through a boy and his relationship to his country, but through a name, through an identity, through the entire architecture of who he had been told he was. His name at that moment was Cassius Marcellus Clay, Jr. And if you know anything about the history of that name, not the Olympic boxer who carried it, but the name itself, where it came from, what it was attached to before it was attached to him, then you understand that the man behind the counter at that 4th Street diner was not just refusing to serve a black kid with a gold medal. He was, without knowing it, enacting a tradition, a very specific, very old, very American tradition of telling people who they were not, which is the precise inverse of the tradition we're actually here to talk about, the one that runs in the opposite direction, backward through time, through ships and coasts and kingdoms and centuries of deliberate forgetting, to a world so different from that diner in Louisville that it requires an act of genuine imagination to hold both realities in your mind at once. So let's try. Let's go somewhere that has nothing to do with Louisville, nothing to do with 1960, nothing to do with hamburgers or gold medals or the particular smallness of a man who won't let another man eat. Let's go to a river, not the Ohio, an older river, a river so old that the civilization built along its banks was already ancient history by the time Columbus was born, by the time the first Portuguese ships began probing the West African coastline with the specific commercial curiosity that would eventually devour a continent. The river is the Niger, and along its great curve, in the interior of what we now call Nigeria, in the period between roughly 1400 and 1800, which is to say, in the exact centuries during which the transatlantic slave trade was assembling the machinery that would eventually produce, generations later, a boy named Cassius Clay on the steps of a house in Louisville. There existed a political and military entity of such scale and sophistication that calling it a kingdom feels almost reductive. It was an empire, the Oyo Empire. And before we say another word about DNA, about haplogroups, about the archival paper trail that connects a Louisville family to a West African bloodline, we need to spend some real time here, in this world, because the depth of what was lost in the crossing is the only true measure of what we're looking for when we go looking for it. The Oyo Empire did not announce itself to the world the way European empires did, with flags planted in soil that already belonged to someone else, and declarations written in the language of the planter rather than the planted. Oyo announced itself the way all genuinely powerful things announce themselves, through consequence, through the fact that its neighbors organized their entire political lives around the reality of its existence, through the specific terror and respect that its cavalry inspired when it appeared on the horizon of a rival city-state, a wall of horses and iron moving at speed across the savannah, carrying men who had been born into a martial tradition so refined and so long that it had its own theology, its own metaphysics, its own understanding of what a warrior was and what a warrior owed to the world that made him. The horse was everything in Oyo. In a region where the tsetse fly made large-scale cavalry difficult or impossible for most of West Africa, the northern Oyo territories sat at an ecological boundary, an edge between the tsetse-infected forest zones to the south and the open savanna to the north, that allowed the Oyo to breed and maintain horses in numbers that no neighboring people could match. This was not luck. This was geography understood as strategy over generations, in the way that only people who have been paying close attention to their own land for centuries can understand it. The Alafin, the king, the owner of the palace, which is the literal translation of the title, sat at the center of a political system that Europeans who studied it in the 19th century kept describing, with barely concealed surprise, as constitutional. Because it was. The Oyo Mesi, the council of 7 senior chiefs, held the power not just to advise the Alafin, but to remove him, to send him, in the formal ritual language of Oyo statecraft, an empty calabash, which was not a gift, but a verdict, a sovereign instruction to die, to vacate the throne, to acknowledge that his mandate had expired, a king who could be fired, in the 18th century, in Africa. The cognitive dissonance this produces in people raised on a certain version of world history is itself a kind of education. But we are not here to rehabilitate Oyo in the eyes of people who underestimated it. We are here because Muhammad Ali's blood runs from this place, or from the world adjacent to it, from the Yoruba cultural universe of which Oyo was the supreme political expression, and we need to understand what that means before we can understand why it matters. The Yoruba concept of Iwa, character, essence, the authentic self, as the foundation of all spiritual and social life, is not a small idea dressed in big words. It is a cosmological claim. It says that before you are anything else, before you are a soldier, a farmer, a king, a slave, a boxer, an exile, a saint, a sinner, you are your character. You are the specific, irreducible quality of your being that existed before you were born and that persists after you die. The Yoruba say, Iwa Pele, gentle character, good character, as the highest praise a person can receive, higher than bravery, higher than wealth, higher than victory. Think about that in the context of a man who, at the height of his fame, at the peak of his physical power, with the heavyweight championship of the world and every commercial opportunity that came with it, looked at the United States government and said, "No, I will not go to Vietnam. I will not put on that uniform. I will not kill people who have done nothing to me in the service of a country that will not serve me." It cost him everything: his title, his license, his prime years, millions of dollars, the possibility, real and present, in 1967, of federal prison. He did it anyway. Wa Pele. Not because he had read Yoruba philosophy, he hadn't. Not because anyone told him that his defiance was an echo of something 1,000 years old and an ocean away, but because the thing that drove him, The specific quality of his resistance had a shape that matched something ancient in a way that can't be fully explained by biography alone. Some things come through the blood. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's stay in the archive for a while longer, because the archive has its own kind of revelations, and they are not gentle. The year is 1850. The place is Madison County, Kentucky. A census taker, a white man with a ledger and a horse and a government commission, is making his way through the county, recording the population of the United States as required by law every 10 years since 1790. He records white households in the main census, names, ages, occupations, property values. When he arrives at a property owned by a member of the Clay family network, not Cassius Marcellus Clay the politician necessarily, but one of the broader family constellation that farmed these Kentucky acres, he does not use the main census ledger for the people who live and labor on that land without wages, without rights, without the legal standing to refuse anything asked of them. He uses a different document, the slave schedule. It is a separate form, printed by the federal government specifically for this purpose, and its design tells you everything you need to know about the philosophy behind it. There are columns for the slaveholder's name, which is written in full, in ink, with the care given to important things. There are columns for the enslaved people, which contain only number, age, sex, color, black or mulatto, and whether they are deaf, dumb, blind, or insane. No names. The federal government of the United States of America in 1850 did not require the names of enslaved people to be recorded because names are things that persons have, and the legal and commercial architecture of American slavery required, above all else, that the people inside it not be persons. So we have, in Madison County, Kentucky, in the 1850 slave schedule, a series of tick marks, a series of numbers, ages and sexes, and the column marked color filled in with a B for black or an M for mulatto. And somewhere in those columns, in those marks, in that deliberate namelessness, is a person, a specific person, a person with a mother and a father and a language and a memory of a world that was taken from them, who will become, through a chain of births and survivals across the next 92 years, the great-great-grandparent of the most recognizable human being on the face of the earth. We cannot tell you that person's African name. That is the point. That is the specific, calculated institutional violence of the slave schedule. Not the whip, not the auction block, though those were real and those were devastating. But this, the bureaucratic erasure of the name, the methodical removal of personhood from the record, so that generations later, when the descendants of that person come looking, they hit a wall of blankness so complete and so official that it feels at first like evidence that the person never existed at all. They existed. We know they existed because Ali exists. And we know more than that now, because there is a tool available to us that the census taker in 1850 could not have imagined, a tool that reaches straight through the slave schedule and the property ledger and the blankness and the silence and the ocean itself, and finds, in the nucleotides of living people, the record that was never supposed to survive. The DNA does not forget. That is the first thing you need to understand about what happens when a genetic sample from the Ali family line goes into a laboratory. The census taker forgot deliberately with the full authority of the federal government behind his forgetting. The slave trader forgot, professionally, because remembering was bad for business. The auction house forgot, architecturally, because its entire physical design, the block, the viewing room, the separate entrance for buyers, was built to process human beings as inventory rather than as people with origins worth recording. But the DNA inside the cells of every person descended from those tick marks in the Madison County slave schedule has been keeping its own record this entire time. Patient, precise, indifferent to history's attempts to overwrite it. And what it recorded in the specific genetic signature carried in the Ali family line is this: the dominant ancestral signal points, with a clarity that makes the geneticist's language unusually unambiguous, to the Yoruba people of southwestern Nigeria and to the Fon people of the Kingdom of Dahomey along the Bight of Benin. Not as a vague, regional suggestion, as a specific population fingerprint, a genetic address that has remained legible across 400 years, and an ocean crossing and the entire catastrophe of American slavery. He came from the Bight of Benin, from the same coastline that swallowed millions, from the same shore where the Route des Esclaves ends at the water's edge, where a tree called the Tree of Forgetfulness still stands, where enslaved people were walked in circles before boarding the ships in a ritual designed to make them lose themselves. They didn't lose themselves. Muhammad Ali is the proof. Now close the loop. A boy on the steps of a house on Grand Avenue in Louisville with a gold medal around his neck, being told by a man behind a counter that he does not exist in a way that qualifies him for a hamburger and a Coke. A man standing at a microphone saying, "I don't have to be what you want me to be." A warrior in a courtroom refusing a uniform. A fighter in exile who came back and won anyway. None of it was new. It was all ancient. It was Oyo cavalry on a savannah horizon. It was Agoji warriors making the French Foreign Legion afraid. It was a Yoruba cosmology that placed authentic character, Iwa, above every other human value, above wealth, above victory, above the approval of kings. It was a people who had already solved, in their theology and their statecraft, the precise problem that Muhammad Ali spent his entire public life dramatizing for the world, the problem of being told who you are by someone who needs you to be less than you actually are. His ancestors answered that problem with iron and horses and philosophy and war. He answered it with his hands and his mouth and an absolute, almost supernatural refusal to be diminished. Same answer, different century. The man behind the counter on 4th Street thought he was refusing to serve a black kid from Louisville. He had no idea he was refusing to serve the living consequence of the Oyo Empire, the genetic heir of Dahomean warriors, the latest iteration of a defiance so old it has its own name in a language he had never heard and would never learn. Hua Pele, the truest self, gentle and unbreakable at once. Muhammad Ali changed his name to reclaim himself. But the self he was reclaiming was older than the name he chose, older than the name he rejected, older than the country that tried to own both names and the body underneath them. It was waiting for him in the blood. It had been waiting for everyone to catch up.